Hello, and welcome to this session of Scrum Master Certification course. In this session, we will discuss an interesting estimation tool, Estimation Poker. As you already know, Estimation Poker, or Planning Poker, is a derivative of Wideband Delphi. This estimation tool makes use of the Fibonacci series to estimate user stories. Let us watch a classroom Scrum session where Planning Poker is being used for estimation. The instructor distributes a pack of cards to each of the 7 participants.
Okay. All right, so all of you guys have a set of these estimation cards. These are also sometimes called Planning Poker cards or Scrum cards. Basically, the set that you have in front of you, this one uses the Fibonacci sequence. If you notice, they go 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, 21, and 34, okay?
The Scrum methodology involves the estimation of user stories and the activities required to deliver the estimated user stories. User story estimation is an essential aspect of Scrum. However, the estimations done by individual Scrum team members and the different Scrum teams will have variations due to the complexity of the activities on hand and the time and effort required in accomplishing them. Therefore, a benchmark is required to set the estimation level so that the estimates can be made in relation to the set benchmark.
But what usually helps initially in trying to, level set the estimation process is agree on one thing in terms of how much something, a task or whatever, would take, what the estimation number is, and then have everyone kind of agree to that.
To understand the concept of planning poker, we will look at the simulated exercise conducted in the classroom.
Let's do an exercise here where together we will figure out what do you guys think in terms of animals? What would you consider a very large animal?
Elephant? Whale?
What do you guys want to say is a big elephant that you all agree with?
Well,
A whale? A whale is a big animal. Okay, so a whale would be equivalent to like a 34. That make sense?
yeah.
What would you consider a very small?
Ant? Seahorse?
What do you guys want to agree as your small animal? Ants. Okay, you're okay with ants. Is everyone good with? All right, so an ant is the number 1.
Okay.
Okay, now with that in mind, and part of the beauty of how this works with the estimation cards, it's anonymous in terms of the of what your guess is. What that means is you would not want to reveal what your estimate is until everyone is ready to reveal it at the same time.
Now the team will estimate the size of an animal in relation to the biggest and the smallest animals that have been predetermined by the team. The animal to be estimated is a horse. Let's see how the estimation is done using Planning Poker.
So given that we've already decided that a whale is a 34
Yeah.
and an ant is a 1, what do you think a horse would be? Now don't show it to anyone yet. Pick out the card that you think for the horse
Yeah.
and get it ready.
Each member picks a card that he or she thinks is the estimate of the horse in relation to whale or ant.
Okay, what do you think a horse would be? Okay. And then the idea is you all show it at the same time. Ready, set, go. Okay, so I get 13, 8, 5, 8, 8, 5. Okay, and you got 13. All right, so the way this works is then the people who had the highest estimate and the people who had the lowest estimate explain why they chose that.
The highest number given to the horse is 13.
So the people who guessed 13, why would you say it's a 13?
The participant who assigned this number says that in relation to an elephant, which he would assign a 21, a horse would be a 13 in size according to him.
All right, how about a few people who guessed low? Who had the 5? You guys both had 5. Why did you guess a 5?
Now the instructor goes back to the person who chose the lowest number. Now the participant with lowest and highest estimates will have to convince each other as to why they assigned their respective numbers.
Okay, so the way that this works, you see, you have an opportunity for the folks that guess on the high end, folks who kind of explain why they chose on the low end, really as a means to kind of convince each other So, oh, okay, yeah, and if you think about it that way, that makes sense. So then perhaps that would change the minds of the other people on the team, and then you do another round of the estimation.
Once the convincing session is done, another round of estimation is conducted.
So now that everyone has kind of explained why they thought it was a 13 or a 5, we'll give another chance to do the estimation. All right, so pick your card. All right.
For the same animal?
For the same animal. For the same animal as the horse.
Each team member re-estimates.
What do you guys think? Go ahead and show your cards. So now you see that more people were at the 8, okay? And then you will usually have someone who still is like, no, it's definitely a 5 or a 7. And then again, you do the same process, you explain, you have to convince everyone else why it's a 5. Does that make sense? So similarly, if you're doing like a task on a project, and everyone on the team gives an estimate for that task.
In Scrum, there is no subject matter expert deciding on estimates. Every team member contributes to the estimation process.
So everyone gets an opportunity to estimate what they think, and then give an opportunity for the team members to convince each other why it's should be bigger or smaller. In a lot of cases, you'll find, oh yeah, I didn't think that we also had to do that task with the server or the.
Planning poker helps the team members to reach consensus on the estimates related to the user stories and activities on hand. This tool facilitates independent thinking by participants, and thus avoiding the phenomenon of groupthink. In this session, we will look at the processes that are part of the plan and estimate phase. We will also discuss the key inputs, tools, and outputs associated with each of the processes. The processes that are part of the plan and estimate phase are: create user stories, approve, estimate, and commit user stories, create tasks, estimate tasks, and create sprint backlog. Plan and estimate phase, as defined in a guide to the Scrum Body of Knowledge, or the SBOK guide, is applicable to the following: portfolios, programs, and/or projects in any industry, products, services, or any other results to be delivered to stakeholders, projects of any size or complexity. Before we discuss the processes in detail, it is important to remember that although all processes are defined uniquely in the SBOK guide, they are not necessarily performed sequentially or in isolation. At times, it may be more appropriate to combine some processes, depending on the specific requirements of each project. Let's begin with understanding briefly each of the processes that is part of the plan and estimate phase. The first process is create user stories. In this process, user stories and their associated user story acceptance criteria are created. User stories are usually written by the product owner and are designed to ensure that the customer's requirements are clearly depicted and can be fully understood by all stakeholders. User story writing workshops, which involve Scrum team members creating the user stories, should be held. The developed user stories are then incorporated into the prioritized product backlog. The next process is approve, estimate, and commit user stories. In this process, the product owner approves user stories for a sprint. After user group meetings, the Scrum Master and Scrum team estimate the effort required to develop the functionality described in each user story. And then, the Scrum team commits to deliver the customer requirements in the form of approved, estimated, and committed user stories. Another process that is part of plan and estimate phase is create tasks. In this process, the approved, estimated, and committed user stories are broken down into specific tasks and compiled into a task list. During this process, a task planning meeting is held to facilitate creation of the task list. Next process is estimate tasks. In this process, the Scrum core team uses task estimation meetings to estimate the effort required to accomplish each task in the task list. The output of this process is an effort estimated task list. The last process that is part of this phase is create sprint backlog. In this process, the Scrum core team holds sprint planning meetings to create the sprint backlog containing all tasks to be completed in the sprint. Let us now discuss the mandatory inputs, tools, and outputs of the Create User Stories process. The mandatory inputs of this process are Scrum core team, prioritize product backlog, done criteria, and personas. Scrum core team. The Scrum team, also referred to as the development team, is a team which is responsible for estimating user stories and delivering the project deliverables. Scrum teams are cross-functional and self-organizing. The team decides the amount of work to commit to in a sprint and determines the best way to perform the work. The Scrum team carries out all the work related to development and testing of deliverables, as well as quality assurance. Prioritize product backlog. The prioritized product backlog contains a prioritized list of business and project requirements written in the form of epics, which are high-level user stories. The prioritized product backlog is based on three primary factors: value, risk or uncertainty, and dependencies. It is also referred to as the risk-adjusted product backlog, since it includes identified and assessed risks related to the project. It also encompasses all approved changes that can be appropriately prioritized in the prioritized product backlog. Done criteria. Done criteria are a set of rules that are applicable to all user stories. It removes ambiguity from requirements and helps the team adhere to mandatory quality norms. A user story is considered done when it is demonstrated to and approved by the product owner, who judges it on the basis of the done criteria and the user story acceptance criteria. Personas. Personas are highly detailed fictional characters, representative of the majority of users and of other stakeholders who may not directly use the end product. Personas are created to identify the needs of the target user base. The product owner can use personas to more effectively prioritize features to create the prioritized product backlog. The tool that must be used in this process is user story writing expertise. The product owner, based on his or her interactions with the stakeholders, business knowledge and expertise, and inputs from the team, develop user stories that will form the initial prioritized product backlog for the project. The prioritized product backlog represents the total sum of what must be completed for the project. The objective of this exercise is to create elaborated and refined user stories that can be approved, estimated, and committed to by the Scrum team. The mandatory outputs of this process are user stories and user story acceptance criteria. User stories. User stories are a simple way of documenting the requirements and desired end-user functionality. A user story tells you three things about the requirements: who, what, and why. The requirements expressed in user stories are short, simple, and easy to understand statements. The predefined standard format results in enhanced communication among the stakeholders and improved estimations by the team. Some user stories may be too large to handle within a single sprint. These large user stories are often called epics. Once epics come up in the prioritized product backlog to be completed in an upcoming sprint, they are further decomposed into smaller user stories. The prioritized product backlog is a dynamic list that is continuously updated because of reprioritization and new, updated, refined, and sometimes deleted user stories due to changing business requirements. User story acceptance criteria. Every user story has associated acceptance criteria. User stories are subjective, so acceptance criteria provide the objectivity required for the user story to be considered either done or not done during the sprint review. User story acceptance criteria also provide clarity to the team on what is expected of a user story, remove ambiguity from requirements, and help in aligning expectations. In the sprint review meetings, the acceptance criteria provide the context for the product owner to decide if a user story has been completed satisfactorily. It is the responsibility of the Scrum Master to ensure that the product owner does not change the acceptance criteria of a committed user story in the middle of a sprint. Now let's look at the mandatory inputs, tools, and outputs of approve, estimate, and commit user stories process. The mandatory inputs are Scrum Core Team, user stories, and user story acceptance criteria. For detailed explanation of these inputs, please refer to the discussion on these in the Create User Stories process. The tool that is to be mandatorily used as part of this process is User Group Meetings. For a detailed explanation of this tool, please refer to the discussion on it in the Create User Stories process. The mandatory output of this process is approved, estimated, and committed user stories. The user stories which are input to this process have high-level estimates which are used by the product owner to approve user stories for the sprint. Once approved, the user stories are estimated by the team. After estimation, the team commits to a subset of approved and estimated user stories that they can complete in the next sprint. These user stories are the approved, estimated, and committed user stories, which will become part of the sprint backlog. Although the product owner approves the initial user stories for a sprint, the final decision about which specific user stories, among those approved by the product owner, should be chosen for the sprint lies with the Scrum team. The Scrum team, in consultation with the product owner if required, finalizes which user stories they will be working on during the sprint. Now let's discuss the mandatory inputs, tools, and outputs of the Create task process. The mandatory input tool and output of this process are Scrum Core Team, Task Planning Meetings, and Task List, respectively. Please refer to the discussion on the mandatory inputs of the Create User Stories process for a better understanding of Scrum Core Team. The tool that must be used mandatorily in this process is Task Planning Meetings. In task planning meetings, the Scrum team plans the work to be done in the sprint by reviewing the committed user stories at the top of the prioritized product backlog. The product owner is present during this meeting to clear ambiguities related to user stories in the prioritized product backlog. This meeting should be time-boxed, with the standard length limited to 2 hours per week of sprint duration. This assists in preventing the tendency to stray into discussions that should actually occur in other meetings, like the release planning or sprint review meetings. By the end of the meeting, the entire Scrum team will have fully committed to deliver a subset of user stories from the prioritized product backlog in the sprint. The task planning meetings may, at times, be referred to as sprint planning meetings or task estimation meetings. The mandatory output of this process is Task List. The task list is a comprehensive list that contains all the tasks to which the Scrum team has committed for the current sprint. It contains descriptions of each task along with estimates derived during the Create Tasks process. The task list must include any testing and integration efforts so that the product increment from the sprint can be successfully integrated into the deliverables from previous sprints. Even though tasks are often activity-based, the level of granularity to which the tasks are decomposed is decided by the Scrum team. Let us now discuss the mandatory inputs, tools, and outputs of the Estimate Tasks process. The mandatory inputs are Scrum Core Team and Task List, whereas the mandatory tools are Task Estimation Meetings and Estimation Criteria, and the mandatory output is Effort Estimated Task List. For a good understanding of the mandatory inputs of this process, please refer to the discussion on the inputs of the Create User Stories process and to the discussion on the output of the Create Task process. The tools that must be mandatorily used in this process are Task Estimation Meetings and Estimation Criteria. In task estimation meetings, the Scrum team members use the task list to estimate the duration and effort for the user stories to be completed in the sprint. One of the key benefits of this technique is that it enables the team to have a shared perspective on the user stories and requirements so that they can reliably estimate the effort required. The information gathered in the task estimation meetings is included in the Effort Estimated Task List and used to determine the velocity for the sprint. Task estimation meetings are sometimes also referred to as sprint planning meetings. The mandatory output of this process is Effort Estimated Task List. The Effort Estimated Task List is a list of tasks associated with the committed user stories included in a sprint. Typically, the accuracy of estimates varies with team skills. Estimated effort is expressed in terms of the estimation criteria agreed on by the team. The effort estimated task list is used by the Scrum team during sprint planning meetings to create the sprint backlog and sprint burndown chart. It is also used to determine when the team needs to reduce its commitment or can take on additional user stories during sprint planning. Let us conclude this session by discussing the mandatory inputs, tools, and outputs of the Create Sprint backlog process. The mandatory inputs are Scrum Core Team and Effort Estimated Task List. Please refer to the discussion on the inputs of the Create User Stories process for a better understanding of Scrum Core Team, and refer to the discussion on Output of Estimate Tasks process for a better understanding of Effort Estimated Task List. The mandatory tool for this process is Sprint Planning Meeting. During sprint planning meetings, each Scrum team member uses Effort Estimated Task List to select the tasks they plan to work on in the sprint, based on their skills and experience. The Scrum team also creates the sprint backlog and sprint burndown chart using the user stories and the Effort Estimated Task List. The mandatory outputs of this process are sprint backlog and sprint burndown chart. Let's look at sprint backlog. It is a list of tasks to be executed by the Scrum team in the upcoming sprint. It is common practice that the sprint backlog is represented on a Scrum board or task board, which provides a constantly visible depiction of the status of the user stories in the backlog. Also included in the sprint backlog are risks associated with the various tasks. Any mitigating activities to address the identified risks would also be included as tasks in the sprint backlog. Once the sprint backlog is finalized and committed to by the Scrum team, new user stories should not be added. However, tasks that might have been missed or overlooked from the committed user stories may need to be added. If new requirements arise during a sprint, they will be added to the overall prioritized product backlog and included in a future sprint. Sprint burndown chart is a graph that depicts the amount of work remaining in the ongoing sprint. This chart shows the progress that has been made by the Scrum team and also allows for the detection of estimates that may have been incorrect. If the sprint burndown chart shows that the Scrum team is not on track to finish the tasks in the sprint on time, the Scrum Master should identify any obstacles or impediments to successful completion and try to remove them. Thank you for watching this video of Scrum Master Certification course.